There's a silent truth about human relationships that few ever come to understand. It's the kind of truth that, when you finally grasp it, has the power to shift the very foundation of your interactions with others. Most of us spend our lives tangled in the complexities of human connection, constantly wondering why some relationships fade away, why others turn toxic, and why betrayal seems inevitable. We ask ourselves why acts of kindness are met with coldness, why indifference can sometimes spark affection, and why some people leave our lives while others return after being absent for so long. We chase affection like it's a treasure we can never seem to find, we demand fairness as if it's a right, we expect gratitude, and we long for understanding. And when we don't receive what we desire, frustration takes root. We try harder, overanalyzing our every move, blaming ourselves, blaming others, questioning where it all went wrong. We ask, why do people treat me this way? But what if I told you the real issue doesn't lie in the way others behave, but in the way we perceive them? What if, just by shifting our understanding of people, everything changed, not just in how they treat us, but in how we feel about it? The key is realizing that the problem isn't them, it's us. This isn't a new idea. Ancient wisdom, from Buddha to Zen masters, has always pointed us in this direction. Our suffering doesn't come from the actions of others. It comes from the expectations we place upon them. The truth is simple, yet it's often difficult to accept. People are not who we think they are. They are only who they are. Once you truly understand this, your entire experience with others will change forever. I invite you to come on a journey of awakening, where we'll dive into the life of a man who learned this transformative truth. His understanding of the world, and his relationships, was forever altered when he let go of his expectations. And once he did, everything in his life changed in ways he never could have imagined. The Merchant's Journey. Once upon a time, there was a merchant named Jack who lived by the banks of a tranquil river. He was a successful man, known far and wide for his thriving trade in silk, spices, and precious stones. His business flourished, and he had built a reputation as a generous and kind-hearted soul. Jack believed in the goodness of people. He thought that if he was kind to others, they would return the favor. If he extended a hand of friendship, it would be met with loyalty. If he gave freely of his wealth, it would eventually be repaid in kind. For years, Jack lived by this simple philosophy. He was the one people turned to in times of need. When his friends faced hardships, Jack lent them money without hesitation. When travelers passed through, he offered them shelter and food without expecting anything in return. He hired the poor and gave them work, hoping to lift them out of poverty. His actions were fueled by a deep belief that kindness would always be met with kindness, and generosity would come back when he needed it most. But life, as it often does, taught Jack a different lesson, one that would slowly unravel his trusting heart and reshape his view of the world. It started with a friend, a man whom Jack had lent a large sum of gold, believing it would be repaid in time. The man promised he would return the money when his business succeeded, and Jack trusted him completely. But as weeks turned into months, the man never returned the money, nor did he offer any explanation. Jack tried to reach out, but his calls went unanswered. The promise was broken, and Jack's faith in the goodness of people began to waver. Next came the travelers. Jack had given them shelter on numerous occasions, offering them a warm bed, food, and the safety of his home. But once their stay ended, they left without so much as a thank you. No words of gratitude, no recognition for his generosity. They simply moved on with their lives, leaving Jack feeling like an afterthought. Then came the workers, those he had hired in the spirit of giving, hoping to offer them a chance for a better life. Jack treated them fairly, paying them well for their hard work. Yet, when they found better opportunities elsewhere, they left without a word of appreciation. Worse still, some of them spread rumors about Jack, turning his kindness into mockery. They spoke ill of him to others, telling stories of how he wasn't as generous as people thought, how he had expectations for what he gave. To Jack, it felt like betrayal. His kindness, which he had always given freely, was now twisted and used against him. With each new disappointment, Jack's heart began to harden. The idealistic view he had held for so long, the belief that people would repay kindness with kindness, slowly crumbled. He became bitter, and the joy he once found in helping others turned into resentment. His view of the world changed, too. He no longer saw people as inherently good. Instead, he began to see them as selfish, ungrateful, and untrustworthy. He felt as though his generosity had been used and discarded, like a tool that had outlived its purpose. Jack's trust in others faded, and in its place grew a deep cynicism. He saw no point in helping others if it wasn't going to be returned. Why give, he thought, when kindness was met with indifference? Why trust when loyalty was so easily forgotten? Slowly, Jack withdrew from those around him. He stopped offering help to others, stopped giving to those in need, and stopped believing in the goodness of people. His heart, once open and full of hope, was now closed off and guarded. But despite the hurt, despite the anger and the disillusionment, there was still a part of Jack that held on to a small sliver of hope. He still believed, deep down, that there was someone out there who would prove him wrong, someone who would show him that goodness could come back, that kindness could still be returned. He waited for that person to appear, the one who would restore his faith in humanity. Yet, as the days and weeks passed, that person never came. The more Jack hoped, the more his expectations grew, and the more frustrated he became. The people around him continued to disappoint him, and Jack's heart grew heavier with each new letdown. He found himself trapped in his own frustration, unable to break free from the cycle of hurt and disappointment. It seemed as though his hope had been in vain. The kindness he had shown had not been returned. The loyalty he had trusted had dissolved. The love he had given had been ignored. And with each passing day, Jack felt more and more like an island, isolated in his own bitterness, disconnected from the world he had once embraced so willingly. But what if, in this moment of deep frustration, there was a lesson hidden beneath the surface? What if Jack's suffering wasn't truly caused by the actions of others, but by the expectations he had placed upon them? What if the key to his peace wasn't in waiting for others to change, but in changing the way he viewed them? Jack didn't yet know it, but his journey toward this realization was about to begin. His heart would soon be open to a new way of thinking, a way that would transform not only his relationships with others but also his relationship with himself. But first, he had to let go of the expectations that had weighed him down for so long. The journey of awakening was about to start, and it would change Jack's life forever. The Master's Lesson by the River. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, casting a golden hue over the river's surface, Jack found himself sitting quietly by the water's edge. The gentle sound of the flowing river seemed to echo his inner turmoil. He had been carrying the weight of his frustration for so long now, frustration with the people who had taken advantage of his kindness, the betrayals he had suffered, and the deep sense of hurt that had become a constant companion. Jack's thoughts churned, tangled with feelings of betrayal, resentment, and confusion. He had always believed in the goodness of people, in the idea that kindness would be returned. But now, that belief had been shattered. Why was it that, no matter how much he gave, how much he trusted, it never seemed to come back to him? His heart had grown heavy with bitterness, and he couldn't understand why life had to be this way. As Jack sat there, lost in thought, an old master appeared beside him. The man looked to be in his later years, his weathered face showing the marks of time and travel, yet his eyes gleamed with wisdom. The master sat beside Jack without a word, allowing the quiet of the evening to settle in. They began talking, first about business, then about the travels they had both experienced, and eventually about life itself. For hours, they exchanged stories, and Jack found himself surprisingly comfortable in the presence of the master. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, someone truly listened to him. But soon enough, Jack's patience wore thin. He could not keep the burden of his frustration bottled up any longer. With a sigh, he turned to the master, his voice heavy with emotion. "I've helped so many people," he began. "I've given freely of my time, my money, my heart. And yet, it always feels like I'm taken advantage of. Friends I've lent money to never repay me. Travelers I've sheltered leave without a word of thanks. Workers I've hired spread rumors and forget my kindness once they find better work. Why does it always seem that when I give, I receive nothing in return? Why does kindness seem to go unnoticed, and loyalty seem to vanish into thin air?" The master listened silently, his eyes calm as ever, as Jack poured out his frustrations. When Jack had finished, the master smiled softly, his face radiating a quiet understanding. He gestured toward the river, where the water flowed steadily, regardless of the rocks and obstacles in its path. "Do you see how the river flows?" the master asked. Jack followed his gaze, watching the river's gentle current move gracefully past them. He nodded slowly, unsure of what the master was getting at. "If you throw gold into the river, will it stop flowing?" the master asked. Jack furrowed his brow, perplexed. "No," he replied. the river will keep flowing. The master then continued, his voice calm, yet carrying a profound weight. If you throw stones into the river, will it flow any differently? Jack glanced at the river again, watching as the water continued its steady course, unaffected by the obstacles it encountered. No, he said, understanding dawning on him. The master nodded, his smile widening. The river flows as it always does, regardless of what is thrown into it. It does not change its course based on what you throw in it. So why do you expect people to be any different? Jack sat in silence, the master's words beginning to settle into his heart. The master continued, speaking with a quiet intensity. Some people will come into your life, and some will go. Some will give, and others will take. Some will remember you, and some will forget. But none of them flow according to your expectations. They flow according to their own nature. Jack's mind struggled to grasp the depth of what the master was saying. He had spent so much time expecting others to return the kindness he had given, expecting loyalty and gratitude. But now, the idea that people were like the river, flowing according to their own nature, was both a revelation and a challenge. Are you telling me to stop being kind? To stop trusting? To stop giving? Jack asked, his voice uncertain. The master chuckled softly, the sound rich with warmth and understanding. Not at all, he said. I am telling you to give, but do not expect. Trust, but do not be blind. Love, but do not hold on too tightly. Jack's eyes widened, his heart heavy with the weight of the lesson. The master continued, his voice steady, yet filled with gentle conviction. When you understand this, no one can betray you, because you will never have assumed they wouldn't. No one can disappoint you, because you will not demand anything in return. No one can break you, because you were never holding on too tightly. Jack sat in stunned silence, as if the very air around him had shifted. He realized, for the first time, that the pain he had been feeling wasn't caused by the actions of others, but by his own expectations. His suffering had been self-inflicted, a result of his desire for others to behave in a way that aligned with his hopes. The moment he could let go of these expectations, he would no longer be bound by disappointment, betrayal, or resentment. As the river continued its journey, unaffected by the passing time or the obstacles in its path, Jack felt a sense of peace begin to settle in his heart. The master had shown him the way to freedom, not by changing the world around him, but by changing the way he viewed it. He no longer had to depend on others for his happiness. True peace came from within, from accepting things as they were, without needing them to be any different. And with that, Jack felt the burden he had carried for so long begin to lift. The lesson of the river had shown him the path to true freedom, and he knew, deep within himself, that he would never be the same again. The transformation begins. At first, Jack's mind resisted the master's words. How could it be so simple? How could he just stop expecting, stop caring about what others owed him in return for his kindness? The thought of not being disappointed again seemed almost too good to be true. His mind kept circling back to old habits, his need for fairness, his desire for gratitude, his longing for loyalty. But deep inside, something stirred. A quiet shift began to happen, one that Jack didn't fully understand yet, but that would change everything. Over the next few weeks, Jack began to observe people differently. At first, it was subtle, like a shift in the way light changes the color of the sky. He started noticing how people praised him when they needed something, but once their needs were met, they moved on without a second thought. He had always taken this personally before, feeling hurt and abandoned. But now, something inside him had changed. Instead of feeling anger or resentment, he simply observed. He saw their actions for what they were, not as a personal attack, but as part of the natural flow of life. People gave when they needed, took when it suited them, and moved on without looking back. Jack realized that this wasn't a betrayal of him, it was simply the way people moved through the world. He began to see how promises were made with great excitement, but when comfort settled in, those promises often faded away. Friends, co-workers, and even loved ones had pledged loyalty, but when the stakes became low, those promises were forgotten. Instead of reacting with bitterness or betrayal, Jack acknowledged this calmly. He realized that people weren't intentionally trying to hurt him. They were simply acting according to their nature, much like the river he had watched with the master. The river didn't stop flowing when stones were thrown into it, it simply kept going. In the same way, people would give and take based on their own circumstances and needs, not according to Jack's expectations. This new perspective, this new understanding of the world, began to dissolve Jack's bitterness. Slowly, he stopped expecting anything in return for his kindness. The weight that had once hung heavy on his shoulders began to lift. He no longer kept a mental tally of who had been kind to him and who had not. Instead, he gave because it was his nature, not because he thought he would receive something in return. The people who truly appreciated him began to stand out clearly. He no longer had to chase after relationships or fight to maintain connections. The few people who remained loyal to him did so by choice, not out of obligation. These were the people who valued him for who he was, not because they needed something from him. The ones who had once taken advantage of his generosity no longer affected him. Their absence in his life no longer created a void. It was simply part of the natural ebb and flow of relationships. As Jack's expectations faded, he began to feel lighter. His mind, once heavy with frustration and disappointment, became freer. He stopped fearing betrayal, because he no longer had the expectation that others would never let him down. He stopped fearing disappointment because he had no more demands on others' actions. With this release, a profound sense of peace settled over him. Jack no longer felt the weight of others' actions pressing against him. He had freed himself from the chains of expectation, and in doing so, he had found a peace he had never known before. Unexpectedly, the people around Jack began to change too. Some of those who had once pretended to care stopped doing so, no longer wearing the mask of friendship when it was convenient. Those who had once felt distant or detached were now drawn to him, not because he demanded it, but because his peace was magnetic. They saw a wisdom in him that wasn't spoken, but felt, a quiet strength that came from letting go. People began to respect him, not because he forced them to, but because they saw in him something they wanted to understand. They were drawn to the authenticity and the serenity that he now embodied. Jack didn't need to say a word to prove his worth or defend his actions. His very presence spoke volumes. And so, Jack began to understand the true nature of freedom. It wasn't in changing others or forcing life to bend to his expectations. The freedom Jack found was in accepting things as they were, letting go of the need for people to meet his expectations, and in doing so, he had changed the very dynamic of his relationships. They no longer had the power to disappoint him. Instead, Jack's peace became the foundation for the connections that truly mattered. The transformation that began so subtly inside him was now clear to all. Jack had changed, and because of that, the world around him had changed too. The shift in perspective, Jack's transformation was nothing short of profound. It was as if the clouds of bitterness, frustration, and disappointment that had hung over him for so long had finally lifted, and in their place, a clear sky of peace and understanding emerged. Once he stopped demanding gratitude, loyalty, and love from others, everything around him seemed to shift. But here's the most important part of it all. People began to treat Jack differently, not because they had changed, but because Jack had changed. The way he saw the world had evolved, and as a result, the world around him began to mirror that new perspective. He stopped holding on to expectations, the belief that people should act in certain ways, return kindness with kindness, or show loyalty when it was convenient. And when he stopped holding on to those expectations, he stopped being hurt. He began to understand that his pain had never been about the actions of others, it was about the expectations he placed on them. Once he let go of those demands, the grip that hurt had on him loosened. Jack learned something deeply freeing during this process, and it's something we can all take to heart. People don't owe you anything. It's a simple but powerful truth. People will act according to who they are, not according to your needs or desires. When you accept this, you stop feeling disappointed. The weight of the world lifts off your shoulders because you stop expecting others to behave a certain way. When you give to others, you give because it is who you are, not because you expect something in return. True generosity comes when we give freely, without needing any acknowledgement or return. And in that giving, we experience the joy of living authentically, without being burdened by the need for reciprocation. Disappointment comes from expectation, not reality. This was perhaps the most important lesson Jack learned. When you stop expecting people to behave in certain ways, when you stop thinking that loyalty, gratitude, and love are things you can demand from others, you stop feeling let down. When someone forgets to thank you, you won't feel ignored. Why? Because gratitude is a personal quality. It is not something that can be coerced or demanded. People will express their appreciation in their own way, and when we stop expecting it in a certain form, we open ourselves to receiving it in unexpected, sometimes even beautiful, ways. True connections come from those who stay willingly. Jack had spent so much of his life chasing after people, desperately holding on to relationships he thought were valuable. But when he let go of his need to keep everyone in his life, he began to see clearly. Those who truly wanted to be around him, who truly valued him for who he was, remained. And those who left were not a source of sadness, but of clarity. Jack saw that the people who stayed by choice were the ones who truly mattered. The rest were simply part of the ebb and flow of life, like leaves carried on the current of a river. Inner peace is the greatest power. As Jack stopped demanding love, respect, and loyalty, he began to experience a quiet strength within himself. The more he stopped demanding, the more he was loved in return, not out of obligation, but out of genuine admiration. When you stop seeking approval from others, you earn true respect. True peace doesn't come from the outside world, it comes from within. And once Jack found that peace, no external force could disturb it. He became unshaken by the actions of others, knowing that his happiness was not dependent on anyone else. Detachment is not coldness. For a long time, Jack believed that detachment meant shutting himself off from the world, becoming cold and indifferent. But the truth was far more beautiful. Detachment, he realized, meant experiencing everything fully, loving without attachment, giving without expecting anything in return, and embracing life without becoming trapped by it. True detachment is the ultimate freedom. It is not about withdrawing from life, but about participating in it without allowing it to define who you are. Jack learned to love without possession, to give without keeping score, and to experience life without clinging to it. This was the freedom he had been searching for all along. Jack's perspective had shifted, and with it, his entire world had changed. He no longer clung to the need for others to act in certain ways. Instead, he allowed people to be who they were, and in doing so, he found that the relationships that truly mattered were the ones that flowed freely, without pressure or expectation. And in this new freedom, Jack discovered a peace that no one could take from him, because it was born from within. As Jack's journey unfolded, he discovered a truth that would stay with him forever. True freedom comes from within. The moment he released his expectations of others, everything began to shift, not just in how people treated him, but in how he felt about himself and his place in the world. His relationships became simpler, lighter, and more genuine, not because others had changed, but because Jack had changed. He had stopped demanding things from people, gratitude, loyalty, love, and in doing so, he opened his heart to the beauty of life as it was, not as he had imagined it should be. The world around him was still the same. People still came and went, some gave and some took, some remembered and others forgot. But Jack no longer felt the sting of disappointment or the weight of unmet expectations. Instead, he saw people as they were, flawed, imperfect, and yet perfectly human. And in that realization, he found a deep sense of peace, one that couldn't be shaken by the actions or inactions of others. As Jack sat by the river, watching the water flow endlessly past him, he understood now that his life, much like the river, was always in motion. He couldn't control the flow, nor could he hold on to it. But by letting go, by accepting things as they were, he found himself in a state of calm that he had never known before. The river didn't stop for anyone, it just flowed. And in that flow, Jack found his own rhythm, his own peace. The lesson the master had shared with him, about giving without expectation, loving without attachment, and living without demanding, had unlocked something inside Jack. It was a truth he could not unlearn. The world was no longer a place where he needed to chase love, approval, or recognition. Everything he needed was already within him, in the way he saw others, in the way he chose to be with the world. And so, Jack's life transformed. He became a man who was truly free, not because he was surrounded by people who always treated him well, but because he no longer required it. He was free because he had let go. He gave without expecting anything in return. He loved without holding on. And in doing so, he created space for the love and respect that was truly meaningful to flow naturally toward him. The people who stayed in his life did so because they wanted to, not because they felt obligated. They were drawn to his peace, to his authenticity, to the lightness in his heart. And the ones who left were no longer a source of pain. They were simply part of the river's flow, coming and going, just as life intended. Jack had found his peace, and in that peace, he was whole. This is the true power of understanding, the realization that we do not need to change others to find happiness. We only need to change how we see them. When we stop expecting and start accepting, we free ourselves from disappointment. When we stop chasing and start allowing, we attract what truly matters. And so, if you find yourself struggling with the actions of others, ask yourself this: what if the real change needs to come from within? What if the peace you seek is already inside you, waiting to be uncovered? Thank you for following Jack's journey. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. How might your own life change if you let go of your expectations? If you accepted others as they are, and gave without demanding? I invite you to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, and if you found value in this video, please like, subscribe, and share it with others. Let's spread the peace of acceptance, and remember, the river flows, whether we're watching or not. And in its flow, we find our own freedom.